So, good afternoon, everyone. We are with our, I guess what we're calling a fireside chat for the annual Muslim Mental Health Conference. Unfortunately, we were not able to meet in person in March when we were originally supposed to have this, but fortunately, we are able to have our conference over this weekend, and we have a big opportunity to learn from our our teacher, Dr. Laleh Bakhtiar. She's been very generous to give us her time today. So I would say that you probably don't need any introduction. MashaAllah, everybody knows who you are. You've been contributing to the knowledge economy for decades, almost a century. So the title of our talk today is Islamic Psychology and a Life Well Lived, a discussion with author, editor, scholar, and retired licensed professional counselor, Dr. Laleh Bakhtiar. So we're just going to have a chance for her to share some of her wisdom with us today. And I think, I mean, for me personally, I came to know you through your translation of the Quran, and I'm sure many people know you for that work. And so it was only, in my years as being a psychologist that it was, mashallah, you are really pioneering the field of what we sort of today call Islamic psychology, or even Muslim mental health, based on our discussions about what you did back in the 90s when you were actually practicing. So you were very active in these fields before they were even really a thing, right? And so, we very much look forward to hearing about your experience. I can only imagine what it must have been like practicing in those days, and if you felt some sort of solitude, if you were by yourself, there wasn't really a field. I don't know. I would love to hear more about that. Or maybe we can start with that question, just sort of like, what was that like when you were practicing as a counselor, given that there was no Muslim mental health conference, there was no Islamic psychology and that sort of thing. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, what happened was I did my graduate work when I was a grandmother. So it was much later in life. Mm-hmm. And I was in a group counseling class, getting a master's in counseling. And the teacher, I was just almost out the door. And the teacher said, "Oh, there's one more method of group counseling you may be interested in. It's called the Enneagram, and it has Sufi origins." Mm-hmm. Well, I had just come from living 20 years in Iran, being a very devout Muslim. No one in Albuquerque, New Mexico even talked about Islam, much less Sufism. And when I heard these words, I thought, oh, God has given me an opening. There's something here. I have to find the origins of this. What are they talking about, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't find any professor interested in doing that. And I decided, okay, based on my age, I better get out of here fast. So I did my PhD on feminine anxiety, math anxiety, just to be able to finish out and get out. Then I found this job with Kazi Publications, where I've been since then in the last 28, 29 years. And I started doing the research to find out the origins of the Enneagram. Ennea means 9 in Greek, and gram means point. So it's a 9-point personality theory that was brought to the West from the Sufis in Central Asia. So it was brought to Paris in the 1920s. So when I started doing the research, I came up with a 3-volume work on moral healing, that actually the Sufi Enneagram teaches us moral healing from the Quran. And so I finished those 3 books, and then I began going to the international conferences, Enneagram conferences. Mm-hmm. No one was interested. And little by little, they even began rejecting the word Sufism because it was connected to Islam. Mm-hmm. So anything connected to Islam was, of course, we're not going to that lecture.
Right. And this was in the 90s, right?
In the 90s, yeah, in the 90s. I mean, I went to the first International Enneagram Conference in Stanford. I think it was 1990. That was the first conference. But I couldn't find anyone who was sympathetic or interested, because a man named, one of the other founders of this Enneagram thing had made it such that you became a type. So you became a 3, or you became an 8, or you became a 7. And this is not the way the Sufi Enneagram works. So people, particularly in the Catholic community, really enjoyed becoming a type, because then they felt they knew who they were, you know. But of course, being a type had both negative and positive qualities. And if you get rid of your negative, then you're not going to be that number anymore.
Right.
So anyway, it was a very difficult time. And finally, I had to not go to the international conferences and things. And I created a computer-based training course in the Enneagram and so forth and so on. I've written several other books since then on the symbol and what it means. And it has Quranic origins, unbelievable method of Sufi psychology and how to heal. And it's just really an amazing, kind of system for moral healing and for Islamic healing.
So for somebody who's not sure about what this term means, moral healing, and this is kind of maybe where we can talk a little bit about how we define our terms and how, what we mean by that. One of the questions I had was about, this idea that you don't necessarily use the word Islamic psychology. Like we talk about Islamic psychology today. We have the International Association of Islamic Psychology. We have people using this term today, right? Islamic psychology. And so you use sort of, maybe one could say, related terms like Quranic psychology or Islamic moral psychology. So are those the same things? And what are they? So how do you understand Islamic psychology? Is it the same thing as Quranic or moral psychology? And what are those and how do they relate? Are they different? Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that, how you see it from your perspective?
Well, as things, once Islam was revealed, all the sciences trace their origin back to the Quran. So Quranic psychology of the self. When we say self, it's the word nafs used in the Quran reflexively. So like myself, yes, myself or his self, right? So the self in the Quranic view is body, soul, and spirit. So you have to include, so as body, as the Quranic psychology about body, that became the basis for Islamic medicine and medicine of the Prophet. Tibbin Nabi.
Yes.
And then the soul becomes like moral psychology or Islamic psychology. And then the spirit becomes Sufism, then the Sufi spiritual way, and so forth and so on. So what Islamic psychology has done, and the reason I think is, well, I should say this, that so in other words, in order to have a science, like we have physics or we have mathematics, you have to have both a theory and a practice. In order to be accepted into the mainstream idea that this is legit, quote unquote. So Quranic psychology then has that. It has a discussion of all three and all aspects of it. Whereas Islamic psychology just doesn't go to the body, for instance, but it uses the spirit in the sense of the Sufi techniques, and it uses the soul, but it doesn't tell you where the soul came from and how we have the soul and what is it and so forth. And the reason I think is because the early people were practitioners, and they were faced with a dramatic situation where there were so many Muslims coming from abroad into like America or Europe or in other places who were suffering from anxiety and depression and stress and these other things. And they needed a Muslim counselor. So they had to come up quickly with techniques that would work because it is the Quran, and Quran is a healing. So these techniques worked, but they didn't come up with the theory. They didn't attach it to a theory. So then what happens is it becomes an alternative kind of psychology. In the same way that in medicine you have Ayurvedic, or you have Chinese, or you have Unani. These are considered alternative systems of medicine, and not the mainstream. So that's what happens with Islamic psychology. It's an alternative method, but it will never be accepted as scientific to be able to show that, for instance, people with anxiety, I use this technique and this and this, and this is what happened, and so forth and so on. In much the same way that there's Christian counseling and there's biblical counseling. So those are not considered mainstream kinds of counseling. Of course, they're helpful because of the belief in God and God's presence in one's life and so forth, but they're not what's called scientific. So Islamic psychology has to decide if it wants to be a science or it wants to be an alternative, in my mind. Now, moral psychology deals only with the soul as well. It doesn't deal with the body necessarily, and it does deal with some of the spiritual aspects in terms of healing, but it's based on ethics. So in the traditional world, the traditional sciences, you had Islamic philosophy, and part of Islamic philosophy was ilm nafs, the science of the soul. So but they only discussed it in its philosophical sense, not in its practical sense.
How to apply that?
Yeah, how to apply it. So then it became, you had to make this connection. Well, okay, now that's what that is, but now how do we apply it? So that's what Quranic psychology does, is take the ilm nafs and how do we apply it based on Quranic theory, on what is in the Quran. Because that way you can always go back to when you're doing a study on anxiety or depression or stress, you can go back to the origins of it within the body or the soul or the spirit, and then it becomes statistically viable. Now, some people don't care. They don't want about quantitative. They don't care. They only want qualitative. Okay, that's fine. But that's a decision that future people have to make. But moral psychology is definitely an alternative that is available, and it was through the science of ethics that because all the sciences were divided into either theoretical sciences or practical sciences, Nazari or Amali. So the Amali sciences consisted of domestic economy, ethics, and politics. These are what they consider to be that system. And so the ethics then developed the whole concept of the psychology from the Greeks. Because when Islam came, very early on, the scholars, as they began to develop, they said, well, there was a whole world out there before Islam. And so what do we do with that world? And they said, as long as it doesn't go against the idea of the oneness of God, it's incorporated into the Islamic view. In much the same way that, for instance, the Torah or the Gospels and the Zoroastrians and these other systems were incorporated into the Quran. So as long as something doesn't go against the Quran, against the oneness of belief of the oneness in God, then it's part of the Islamic tradition and culture and civilization. So that's how moral psychology developed, was through the science of ethics as a practical, kind of psychology. So those are basically kind of so the Quranic psychology is the basis because it treats body, soul, and spirit. It discusses body, soul, and spirit. And then Islamic psychology is a branch it obviously stems from the Quran because it talks about the soul, and the soul, it has different aspects like the nafs and the ruh and the qalb and so forth. But it doesn't have a theory that's a tied down theory. So it's going to either remain alternative or it's going to become mainstream, depending on what the people, the practitioners decide they want to do. And that's their choice.
So what do you have an idea of what an Islamic psychology theory should be or might be?
Well, yeah, that's what's in the book, The Chronic Psychology of the Self. Yeah. That's what's in there. That is the theory of the soul.
The theory of the self.
Yeah, right. But if you want it for psychology, you just read the part on the soul.
Mm.
There's
Yeah.
a part on the body. But I mean, like, interestingly enough, this is a very interesting kind of thing that happened. So in the early Islamic centuries, they began translating the Greek texts into Arabic. And before that time, these Greek texts were just there, and no one, and they were almost lost. So if the Arabs had not translated it all into, had not been translated into Arabic language, the whole of the Greek of Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, Pythagoras, all of these people's works would have been lost. So what happened was the translators were called Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Ishaq ibn Hunayn, his son. They were unbelievable men in translating. They knew Syriac, they knew Greek, they knew Arabic, and so forth. So when they translated from the Greek, they came to the word, for instance, the humors. Mm. Now, in Islamic body, in the study of Islam, the body, we consider, the Quran talks about the humors. So how does it talk about the humors? In the second verse revealed to the prophet, he said, I created you of a blood clot. That's exactly what the humors are. They're a blood clot. Yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood that are part of the humors are a blood, like a blood clot. So, well, how come then when it comes to the text, that's translated as akhlot instead of alaq? And the reason is because Hunayn ibn Ishaq was a Christian and he hadn't read the Quran. So he didn't know the Quranic connection to this word. And therefore he brought in, just a regular word meaning mixture kind of thing, rather than using a Quranic term. But otherwise, they always tried to go back to the Quran.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That's interesting. I think I don't know if, from my perspective, sort of being in a different, coming into Islamic psychology at a different generational point, right? And sort of seeing the climate around me and how different people define things and that sort of thing. Yeah, would you agree with the sentiment that these different terms might be describing a similar essence, but that maybe the terms can be somewhat interchangeable? Because what I hear you describe in terms of a Quranic psychology, I hear that same description in Islamic psychology. So I wonder if it's semantics.
No, they are the same, because the Islamic psychology is based in Quranic psychology. But it just doesn't take the whole thing. It just takes a part of it, simply because they weren't theorists. So they didn't develop a complete theory of Islamic psychology. They just developed the practical aspects of it, simply because they had to. In order to treat the people who were coming to them, they had to have some way of it, expressing it. And they've done a marvelous job, absolutely marvelous. But it's up to them now, or those people who are followers of Islamic psychology, to decide, okay, we want to remain an alternative, like Christian counseling, or we want to become mainstream. That's up to them.
Yeah.
I mean, over time will tell.
Right. Well, I think now, I mean, certainly some of the things that I've, seen as being, a member of the American Psychological Association, and just seeing, my own thinking on where religious psychologies fall within the broader mainstream. I argue that we should not otherize, whether biblical psychology, Christian psychology, Quranic psychology, Islamic psychology, whatever you want to call it, that I actually feel quite firmly that we should not think of them as alternative, because it others yourself and it disempowers you. That no, we are actually, Islamic psychology is not some niche field. It is part and parcel of mainstream psychology. And if you look at how psychology is structured today, or even how the American Psychological Association as an organization is structured into its different divisions, the different journals it has associated with those divisions, that all of the things that we talk about that one might consider Islamic psychology, there is space for that within the broader mainstream. So for example, Abdullah Rothman, who is the executive director of the International Association of Islamic Psychology, just published in a peer-reviewed APA journal, Spirituality and Clinical Practice, where I'm an associate editor. He published a theory of personality and application based on this, the structure of the self. So the nafs, the ruh, the aql, the qalb, and that sort of thing. So there are publications. I mean, this was a very important publication that actually just came out like a few weeks ago, maybe less. So I don't know, what your thoughts are on that of seeing somebody of a different generation, because I can totally understand where you're coming from.
Right.
As
yeah. Well, no, that's very good. But see, again, it's a partial. It's not a case study. It's not an actual, I mean, yes, it was, reviewed. Yes, it was in the,
well, that's just one of many,
right.
Human Keshavarzi and others, Amber Hawk.
No, they're doing a beautiful job. I mean, absolutely amazing. Not only because they're able to write, because they're actually healing people.
Yeah.
They're healing their anxiety and their stress and their depression and from an Islamic perspective. So, I mean, what more could you ask for? But as I said, I mean, I found, for instance, with the Sufi Enneagram, the Enneagram community tried to become mainstream, like the Myers-Briggs.
Yes.
And they couldn't do it. They can't do it. I mean, recently they've come up with a couple of tests that say, okay, yes, you're this type or that type and whatever. And by the way, even though they had rejected Sufism and Islam, all of their tests are based on that 3-volume work that I did. So it's all based on Sufi ideas again, So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a, fortune teller or whatever, future foreteller, whatever. And I certainly hope that it's able to become mainstream and remain mainstream and so forth. But I've seen, I mean, like Christian counseling isn't considered mainstream, So religious counseling simply, because they don't accept the APA doesn't accept the concept of soul, which is the word psyche, which is the word psychology, the study of the soul, the study of the psyche. So when they don't accept that word, and then you're talking, Dr. Rothman's talking about the soul and this, that. Well, they don't even accept the soul. The one thing that modern psychology doesn't discuss is the soul. They may say it's the mind sometimes, a little bit this, a little bit that, but because of the time of Descartes, they've split it. And so it's a uphill battle, but it needs to be done. And it needs to be done through the theory, because there's one, for instance, Islamic psychologist, who's the main one I referred to, who says that the soul came into being with the body. So they're not separate. It's not a duality. It's the same thing.
Yeah, so, I think where some people are at is that not about, it's, my experience, for example, being in APA, it's like that one question, like who is they? I was having a conversation recently with a past president of APA. And, we were having this discussion about how different subgroups, feel, might have complaints, or might feel unwelcomed, or have complaints about not feeling included. And she says, APA is us, all of us. It's not they, it's me as a Muslim psychologist, and psychology as I understand it. It's the Native American psychology, it's the Asian and Latino psychology, it's the Black psychology, it's the, all of these different groups who have their own idea about what psychology is, including those groups whose psychology is predicated on the notion of a soul. All of what I just described, that is APA, and we are all welcome.
Right.
That was the president of the APA.
Right. No, there's no question about it. They welcome them, but they still, in scientific terms, they don't accept it as scientific. They're welcome into the community because, well, they're going to pay dues, and why would you turn people away? I mean, you know. And also, it's an open forum.
Yeah.
It's open forum, so it has to be open to everybody. That's what this whole country is about.
Yeah.
Is openness to all people of all faiths, of all beliefs, of all ideas, and so forth. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted as part of the mainstream. You know, just being part of the APA doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be, you know, go into. Now, maybe someone, as I said, who cares? Maybe you don't need it. You know, maybe we just need qualitative research and we're happy with that. And you certainly can get qualitative research out of Islamic psychology or Quranic psychology or moral psychology, you know. So is that your daughter?
No.
Oh, yeah. So anyway.
Okay, so to pick up where we left off, let's talk a little bit about, I think it would be really interesting for some of our clinicians out there to maybe have a little bit of an inside, you know, bird's eye view into what your clinical practice was like. Again, you know, in the 1990s. 1990s was a very busy time for you. So, and I know that we had spoken, exchanged a few emails about that at some point in time. But can you share a little bit about like what that was like, what your practice was like and that sort of thing, who your clients were, what they were dealing with and that sort of thing?
Right. Well, actually, that was not, it wasn't a very good experience.
It wasn't a good decade?
No, no, it wasn't. The counseling part, the Sufi Enneagram part was good, but the counseling part was not good because I chose to work with teenage girls from Central Asia who were having suffering with their parents who had come with the cultural baggage from, you know, India and Pakistan, and were trying to enforce that culture here on their daughters while they're sending them to American high schools where they're sitting next to boys, American boys or whatever, and then telling them, no, you have to go on Sundays, you go to this Sunday school, but the boys are over there and the girls are over there, and you have to marry someone from over there. And the girls are saying, well, wait a minute, I don't even know those people. I know this guy. And so I was an advocate for the girl. And the parents were becoming very upset with me. And, you know, kept enforcing that I had to say what they said. I had to just repeat what they said. And I said, but no, that you're trying.
That's not the role of a counselor.
Right, yeah. So they stopped paying me. So I realized, okay, well, this isn't going to work. I can't support myself with this now. So it was a time when there were so many people, immigrants coming from abroad, who brought their own culture with them. And they were still speaking their own language. And they were still connected. They still had extended family and so forth. So there were people for them to talk to and relate to and ask questions about and so forth. But many, many, many young people got lost along the way there. Many, many, because of the cultural problems.
Can you talk a little bit about your context in terms, you know, professionally, like, so you as a Muslim counselor, and especially given the fact that you were involved in this particular approach with the Sufi Enneagram and that sort of thing. So what kind of support did you have as a professional in at that time, as you were working as a counselor?
Yeah, well, no, basically there wasn't any because there was no one interested. You know, I mean, even you said Sufi, that's usually people accept that rather than if you say Islam, you're definitely not going to get accepted. But people hadn't really heard of Sufi in the 60s. You know, there'd been Idris Shah and so forth. And I'd written 2 books on Sufism, one published by University of Chicago Press, another by Thames and Hudson. But still, it wasn't a main term people were familiar with. So there was no support whatsoever.
From whether the counseling association, right, that sort of thing.
No.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious your thoughts on, you know, how the terrain has evolved since then. So obviously now, you know, we have, you know, as I mentioned before, we have associations and institutions that deal specifically with Islamic psychology or even Muslim mental health. We have conferences. I believe this conference that we're attending now, I think it's the 12th annual, if I'm not mistaken. So certainly, you know, and now we have the Journal of Muslim Mental Health, and we have the Institute of Muslim Mental Health, and all of these other beautiful initiatives. We have, you know, the Muslim Counselor Network, and, you know, all of these different kinds of communities and that sort of thing. So I'm just curious your thoughts on how this has evolved since those earlier days.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great time to try to be an Islamic counselor, because there is all this support for you.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, you're actually healing people. So it's very important. There's so many people in need, you know, because of the modern kinds of illnesses and so forth and so on. And it's just wonderful that there's so many opportunities, and, you know, so many people out there to support you and to help you. And it's a growing field, and it's really something that young people should consider going into, I think, definitely.
Well, I would just remind you that, you know, you might have felt unsupported and lonely, like on an island back in the 90s when you were just kind of you, yourself, and you, right?
Right.
But what I would say is that that work wasn't lost, whether the sessions you did with people that left their mark, or the scholarship that you did, you know, sitting in the confines of your own personal space, and all of those beautiful publications that you have that all of us may benefit from. It wasn't lost. So
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
we have
Alhamdulillah.
we have this, you know, more robust culture now, certainly. But you know, we always build on other people's shoulders. So certainly you are part of that. You know, we
Oh,
build
thank you
on
so much.
what you had done when we were in high school.
Yeah. Yeah. No, alhamdulillah, you know, the work is there, and that's what's kept me going as well, because at some point there is going to be some legacy. There's going to be someone who can go back and refer to these things and so forth and so on.
Beautiful. I mean,
So,
all of these books and everything is
yes.
beautiful.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, God's blessings, yeah. And that's why, even though I had no outside encouragement or support, I never lost faith in doing it. You know, is because I was thinking about, okay, well, there'll be something lasting here in case someone ever wants to know.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, when you have that calling, you know what I mean? It's almost like you have to
Right.
do it regardless of what's going on in
Exactly.
places.
Exactly. Yes. That's exactly right. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what would you like people to know, sort of most about your work, or what do you want people to remember most about your work? Of course, we hope that your work is not over,
No,
that
right.
you're continuing to move. But what do you hope your sort of legacy or most important contributions will be, or that because you know, you have, mashallah, you have so many publications, so and you leave, you know, you have a big legacy. But if you could just take from that like one or two or maybe three things that, you know, this is the most important thing. You know, it's like I have this thing with my daughter Lena, you know, where I say, if mommy can only, if you only get one lesson from mommy, you know, because we're always teaching our children. Are you there? Are you there? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here now.
I know
We got lost for a while.
I
Not sure what happened. Yeah.
I hope, yes, we are recording. Yeah,
Okay.
no, like I was just saying that, you know, we're always teaching our children, you know, a million different things all of the time. And I always say to my daughter Lena, who's 9 now, if you only remember one thing from mommy, if I only can teach you one thing, you get to an adult and there's only one thing mommy left stuck in your head, is to be close with Allah. to have a strong relationship with God. If this is the one thing, this is what I would want it to be, that you know
Yes.
God is there and you're close with him and your bond with him is close. This is
Yes.
mommy's one overarching legacy to you, if you can only take away one thing.
Right. Yeah. Oh,
So
that's so nice.
what
Yeah.
would that be from you?
Well, of course, it is the same thing. Obviously, I mean, I've had I have 3 children and 8 grandchildren, and that has been my message, to them as well. But in terms of a professional kind of career and things, um, I early on realized that the Quran has been neglected,
Mm.
and the Hadith has been too over, emphasized. I'll give an example. Like, someone came into the bookstore, the publishing company once, and he said, oh, he gave the khutbah at the previous Jomeh prayer, and he said, and then I remembered this hadith which went this, 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 and this, and so I was very happy that I remembered the hadith. I said, well, the Quran says that. Why wouldn't you have said the Quran says that? You know, and so he got very upset with me that I even asked him that. but people memorize the hadith rather than memorizing the Quran. I mean, how many of the all verses of the Quran, other than Qul Huwallahu Ahad, I mean, do we actually memorize? So my whole kind of challenge has been to try to make the Quran become alive. So that's why, for instance, in translating the Quran, I did it the way I did it, and so forth and so on. Then I've done a book on Quranic Sunnah, which takes all the commands in the Quran, that then from that became the Sharia. From those commands became the Sharia. So what were they? Can we trace them back to the Sharia? Which parts of the Sharia actually work, which don't, based on these Quranic ideas? Then I also did a chronological Quran, because of we don't know when verse by verse was revealed, but they do have a section, they agree on when the chapters were revealed. So it's a chronological Quran, and then which verses are Medina and which are Meccan, that are mixed into the whole, kind of thing. So, and then I also found from translating the Quran that it taught me how to be a critical thinker, which means basically someone who asks questions. So the Quran, 1/6 of the Quranic verses are questions. Will you not be reasonable? Why aren't you listening? Where are you now? I mean, constantly God is telling us, well, wake up there, with these questions. And we just kind of read through it, during Ramadan, and, we never really quite get the whole, gist of the whole thing. So, anyway, this has been my main point. And now Quranic psychology, of the self. I've done many other works, but these are the ones that I feel were the most going to be helpful in keeping the Quran alive and awakening up people to the Quran. And, because the hadith then all causes problems. I mean, particularly like in the verse 434, you read both sides of the issue. Could you beat women or not beat women? So that's not going to solve anything. So therefore, the Quran itself and what it shows us, and the blessings that we get from rereading it, and opening it and finding many, many more ways of understanding it in our lives, and putting it to use and so forth. Because the greatest miracle of Islam is the Quran. And there's no way, we can, there's nothing that compares to that.
Beautiful. Mashallah, mashallah. May all of your beautiful works speak for you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Dr. Laleh, if we can just have one final question before we wrap things up. What can we expect from you going forward? As the audience is probably aware, you'll be celebrating your 82nd birthday in July, in just a few weeks. And so have you done what you feel you came here to do? Is there more up your sleeve? What can we expect from you moving forward?
Well, I haven't really decided what's going to be the next approach, because I've done a couple of books after Quranic psychology, which are not into the psychology world. They're about women's rights, and so I didn't want to discuss those. But I'm again looking to the Quran and some aspect of the Quran that hasn't been covered or stated or said in terms of psychology, maybe explaining more about the soul, something like that. But I haven't really quite decided yet what it'll be. But
So
inshallah,
go ahead.
yeah, inshallah, with God's blessings, I'll be here to be able to continue writing and doing. And yeah, I mean, I'm very passionate about it and enjoy every minute of it.
So you're not retiring. There is,
No,
there's more stuff that you want to do. You're
right.
just haven't
Yeah.
chosen which one.
Right, which path to take yet. Exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I have just, on the abstract, which hopefully will be in the Muslim mental health program, they'll be able to see 7 or 8 of just the publications of yours that are related to psychology. So, mashallah, hopefully they can, people that are interested can get those and benefit from those. Thank you so much for sharing your time and
you're
your
welcome.
wisdom and your expertise with
Yes.
us today. And
thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for the interview. And may God bless you and continue to bless your work. You're doing such a tremendous job, and it's just really fascinating how you're able to bring all of this together. And I thank you so much.
If anybody needs to get in touch with you, they can do so.
Yeah, it's my first name, Laleh, at Bakhtiar, my last name.org. That's my email.
You're going to get a barrage of emails.
Right. No problem. Thank you so much, Dr. York. Thank you.